Hey everyone, welcome back. Did you know we're already over 8 billion people on this planet? Crazy, right?
Yeah, it's a lot of people to share resources with.
Definitely makes you think. And that's what we're doing in this deep dive. We're taking a look at excerpts from a sociology textbook
Okay.
to try and understand how this population boom and our growing cities are affecting the environment.
It really is fascinating. I mean, they impact everything
Yeah,
from where we live to global politics even.
absolutely. Okay, so let's start with that 8 billion number. We hit 7 billion between 2011 and 2012, and now
Right.
we're already at 8 billion. So to understand how we got here, we need to talk about demography.
Yeah, so demography is basically the study of populations.
Mm-hmm.
And it comes down to looking at fertility rates, which is how many children are born per woman on average, and then also mortality rates, so the number of deaths. And these rates, they can vary a lot around the world, and those differences are really important.
For example, the textbook compares Afghanistan, Finland, and the United States. In 2018, Afghanistan had a fertility rate of 4.4 children per woman,
Wow.
while in the U.S. it was only 1.7. I mean, that's a huge difference. So what does that kind of variation actually mean in the bigger picture?
Well, high fertility rates, like in Afghanistan,
Yeah,
can really strain resources.
yeah,
And it makes it difficult for a country to provide education and healthcare, jobs even,
right.
for its growing population. It can even impact economic growth. Low fertility rates, like in Finland and the U.S., can lead to worries about an aging population and a shrinking workforce.
So kind of a trade-off either way.
You could say that, yeah.
Okay, well, this brings to mind the Malthusian theory. You know, Thomas Malthus.
Oh, yeah, of course.
He predicted that population growth would eventually outstrip our ability to produce food, leading to all kinds of stuff. Famine,
Yeah.
war, disease. Pretty bleak.
Yeah, I mean, he was really worried about exceeding the carrying capacity of the planet.
Yeah. So do you think his theory is still relevant today? Especially with climate change being such a big issue.
You know, Malthus definitely raises valid concerns about the limits to growth, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also the cornucopian theory to consider.
Right, right.
And that suggests that human ingenuity and technology will always find a way to provide for our needs,
Okay.
regardless of population size. Think about advancements in agriculture, resource extraction, even things like vertical farming.
So are we doomed to a Malthusian fate, or will innovation save us? I'm kind of leaning towards cautious optimism, I guess.
It's a tough question,
Phrase-
really, with no easy answers. There's another theory, though, that might offer a more nuanced perspective.
Okay, I'm listening.
It's called demographic transition theory, and it basically argues that as societies develop, their population trends change in predictable ways.
Okay, so break that down for me a little bit. What are these predictable ways?
Sure, so the theory outlines 4 stages. The first stage, both birth and death rates are high, so population growth is slow. Then as healthcare and sanitation improve, death rates decline, but birth rates stay high. So you get this rapid population growth.
So, like, what happened during the Industrial Revolution?
Exactly. Good example.
Makes sense. So what happens next?
Well, in the third stage, as societies become more industrialized and urbanized, birth rates start to go down. People have access to better education, family planning. The economic incentives for having large families diminish too.
So we're talking about places like the U.S. and Finland here.
Exactly. They're in that third stage. Birth rates are declining, but the population's still growing because people are living longer too.
Right, right.
And finally, in the fourth stage, both birth and death rates are low,
Okay.
resulting in a stable or even like a slightly declining population.
I see. So it's not just about the total number of people, but also where a society is on this demographic transition pathway.
Precisely.
Yeah.
That's a dynamic process for sure.
Okay, that makes sense. So as the population keeps growing, so do our cities. It's like this magnetic pull drawing people in from rural areas.
It's true.
How did we go from those ancient settlements to the megacities we see today? What's driving this constant urban expansion?
Well, those early cities, like the ones in Mesopotamia, faced a lot of limitations. You know, sanitation, food supply,
Yeah.
even defense. I mean, Rome was an exception, of course. It
Yeah.
reached about 650,000 inhabitants at its peak.
Wow.
But most ancient cities were way smaller because of those challenges.
Right, that makes sense. But then something shifted, right? Like the Industrial Revolution changed everything.
It did, absolutely. The rise of factories and the promise of jobs, that pulled people from the countryside into urban centers.
Yeah, like those old mill towns in New England.
Yes, exactly.
Or those bustling streets of 19th century London.
It must have been quite a sight.
It must have.
Right?
But I imagine those early industrial cities were pretty tough places to live. overcrowding and poor sanitation. Not very glamorous, huh?
Not really, no. They faced a lot of challenges. The living conditions for a lot of people were really harsh.
Yeah, I can imagine.
But then something interesting happened. Suburbs started popping up. People started looking for more space.
Ah, the suburbs.
Yes.
Yeah.
A better quality of life, maybe?
Yeah.
And an escape from that gritty industrial city.
Right, that classic picture of a white picket fence and a green lawn. But even that move to the suburbs, it has its own set of consequences, right? I mean, longer commutes,
Sure.
increased reliance on cars, sprawling development that eats up natural habitats.
You're right. The desire for more space and a certain lifestyle, it often leads to greater consumption of resources and a much heavier environmental footprint. And it's not just an American thing, you know?
Right.
Think about those Parisian banlieues. They paint a different picture of suburban life.
Right.
You know, they struggle with poverty, unrest, and they often don't have access to the same opportunities as those in the city.
That's a really good point. It really challenges our assumptions about what suburban even means in different parts of the world.
Yeah.
And all those complex social and economic factors that shape these urban landscapes. But it also leads to a crucial question. As our population grows, as cities sprawl outwards, what does that mean for our environment? I mean, we're all sharing these finite resources.
Yeah, that's where the concept of carrying capacity comes in.
Right.
The maximum population size that an environment can sustainably support.
Okay.
It's a question that's puzzled scientists and policymakers for centuries.
And a question we're going to keep exploring in our next part. So join us then as we delve a little deeper into the environmental impacts of all of this.
See you there.
All right, so we've established there are a lot of us on this planet and we're increasingly living in cities. But what does that actually mean for the environment?
Yeah, that's a question.
Like, we hear about climate change and pollution,
Right.
but I feel like this deep dive is making me think about it in a whole new way.
It's true. These issues can feel overwhelming, especially with the constant flow of information.
Right.
But sometimes, you know, just understanding the root causes and how these challenges are all connected can help us make sense of it.
You're right. It's all about connecting the dots. So what are some of the biggest environmental pressures we're putting on the planet right now? How do population growth and urbanization contribute?
Well, a classic example is the tragedy of the commons.
Okay.
It shows how shared resources can be depleted when people act in their own self-interest without considering the impact on everyone else.
So give me an example.
Sure. Imagine a pasture that's open to everyone for grazing. Each person wants to add more cattle to their herd because they benefit individually, right? But if everyone keeps adding more and more cattle, the pasture gets overgrazed.
Right.
And then ultimately everyone suffers.
It's a powerful analogy. It shows how individual actions, when you multiply them across billions of people, can have these huge consequences.
It's true.
Almost like we need a global mindset shift to start thinking about the long-term sustainability of our actions.
Absolutely. And we see this happening in so many ways, from deforestation and overfishing to the depletion of fresh water.
And then there's climate change, which is probably the biggest environmental challenge of our time. It's safe to say most people now accept that the planet is warming.
Right.
Even NASA's data confirms that 2020 was one of the warmest years on record.
Yeah, the evidence is pretty clear at this point.
Yeah.
But the real debate now isn't about whether climate change is happening. It's about what we do about it.
Right.
And who's responsible for taking action.
Yeah, that's where things get complicated, right? Because there are so many perspectives on the solutions. Plus, the impacts of climate change aren't felt equally around the world.
Exactly. And the world systems perspective highlights a really crucial point. The countries that benefited the most from industrialization.
Like,
The U.S. and Western Europe. Historically, they contributed the most to greenhouse gas emissions. And now developing nations, who are often least equipped to deal with the consequences, are facing the worst of it.
so that raises some serious questions about fairness and responsibility.
It does.
How do we balance the need for economic development with the urgency of addressing climate change? Who should bear the costs?
Those are the tough questions policymakers and global leaders are dealing with right now. There are no easy solutions.
No, for sure.
But recognizing these power dynamics and the historical inequalities, that's a key starting point.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've got climate change. But let's not forget about pollution.
Oh, right.
It's in the water we drink, the soil we grow our food in, the air we breathe. Easy to overlook in our daily lives, but it's a problem.
It is a pervasive problem, for sure.
Yeah.
And again, population growth and urbanization play a part. More people means more demand for resources, more waste generated,
Right.
and often more pollution as a side effect of our consumption.
The textbook had this crazy stat. Almost 3 billion people don't have access to clean water at home for hand washing.
It's a staggering number.
It really highlights the inequalities that exist.
Yes, both within and between countries.
Yeah.
And even in developed nations like the United States, we're not immune to water pollution. I mean, remember the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, catching fire because of industrial waste. Multiple times.
It's a stark reminder that these problems can happen anywhere. And we haven't even touched on soil contamination
Right.
from pesticides and fertilizers or air pollution from factories and car exhausts.
Yeah, it's this complex web of interconnected challenges, and they often impact communities that are already marginalized the most.
Which brings us to a topic that our source material really emphasized: environmental racism. Can you explain what that is and why it's such a pressing issue?
Basically, environmental racism is how minority communities and low-income neighborhoods are disproportionately burdened with environmental hazards and pollution. They're more likely to live near things like toxic waste facilities, industrial sites, or polluted waterways. They often have limited access to green spaces, clean air, healthy food even.
So it's like their health and well-being are being sacrificed
In a way, yes.
for the sake of economic growth or convenience for others.
The textbook had a shocking statistic. Black children are 5 times more likely to have lead poisoning than their white counterparts.
Wow, that's unacceptable.
It is, and it speaks to those systemic inequalities that are ingrained in our social and environmental systems.
It really shows how environmental issues are fundamentally connected to social justice.
It's true.
It's not just about protecting the planet, it's about protecting people.
And it's important to remember that environmental racism isn't just a problem in the United States. Indigenous communities around the world often face similar challenges.
Right.
Their lands being exploited for resources or used as dumping grounds for hazardous waste.
Speaking of which, the story of Centralia, Pennsylvania really stayed with me. A town that literally caught fire underground and is still burning. Can you imagine living with that constant fear?
It's like a powerful image,
Yeah.
a haunting reminder of the long-term consequences of environmental neglect and the real human cost of these disasters.
And sadly, Centralia isn't unique. The textbook mentions several cases of Native American tribes being targeted for hazardous waste disposal
Right.
or facing health issues from uranium mining on their land. It's like history repeating itself.
One case that stands out is the Skull Valley Band of Goshute Indians. Their land was considered as a potential site for a high-level nuclear waste dump. Can you believe that? After
cool.
decades of uranium contamination.
It's like they were being asked to take on even more.
Essentially, yes. It's a clear example of how economic incentives are sometimes used to justify environmental injustice.
And it highlights those power imbalances where marginalized communities don't have the resources or the political power to fight back against these harmful projects.
Exactly. It's a systemic problem that needs systemic solutions. We need stronger environmental regulations, more equitable distribution of resources,
For sure.
and a deeper understanding of how social and environmental justice are connected.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of heavy stuff today. Population explosions, sprawling cities, pollution, environmental racism. It can feel overwhelming.
It's true. They are complex and challenging issues. But it's important to remember that we're not powerless. We can make a difference, both individually and collectively.
That's a good reminder. It's easy to feel paralyzed by how big these problems are. We can't give up hope. We need to find solutions and create a more just and sustainable future for everyone.
One thing that stood out to me in the textbook was the concept of sustainable development. It's about finding ways to meet our needs today without compromising the ability of future generations to meet theirs.
So thinking long-term, not just about instant gratification or short-term profits, it's about thinking about the impact of our choices.
Exactly. It requires a real shift in our mindset, moving away from the idea that we can endlessly exploit resources without consequences.
Okay, so sustainable development sounds like a good goal, but what does it actually look like? How do we make it a reality? So we talked about the problems. But what about solutions? I mean, sustainable development sounds great in theory, but how do we actually make it happen? Is it just about like recycling and using less energy, or is there more to it?
It's definitely more than just individual actions. We need to transform whole systems. You know, how our cities are designed, how we produce and consume goods,
Right.
how we generate energy, even how we govern ourselves.
Okay, so big picture thinking.
Yeah.
But what are some like tangible examples? What could this actually look like?
Well, imagine cities that are designed around public transportation, and walkability, so you
Yeah.
don't need a car as much. Picture buildings with green roofs, solar panels, generating their own energy. And what if factories adopted circular economy principles, where waste is minimized and materials are constantly being reused?
Okay, yeah, I'm starting to get the picture. It's about rethinking the way we do things at every level, from our own choices to
Breast.
these big global systems. But that sounds like a massive undertaking. Like, where do we even begin?
It starts with recognizing that sustainable development isn't just about protecting the environment. It's about improving human well-being, too.
Right, so they're connected.
Exactly. When we invest in renewable energy, for example, we create jobs, A&D, reduce pollution.
Okay, yeah.
When we promote sustainable agriculture, we ensure food security, A&D, protect biodiversity. And when we design cities with green spaces, we improve public health, A&D, create more livable communities.
I see what you mean. So it's about finding solutions that benefit both people and the planet, recognizing that our well-being is tied to the health of our environment.
Exactly. But it takes a collaborative effort.
Yeah.
Governments need to enact policies that encourage sustainable practices.
Yeah.
Businesses need to innovate, invest in green technologies.
Yeah.
And individuals, we need to make cautious choices in our daily lives, too.
It sounds like we all have a role to play then. So what are some things that we as individuals can do to contribute to a more sustainable future?
Well, reducing our consumption is huge. Do we really need that new gadget? Or can we repair what we have? Can we walk or bike instead of driving? Can we choose products with less packaging or opt for reusable alternatives?
Yeah, those are all good points. It's about being more mindful of our choices and understanding that small actions can add up.
They can, for sure. And don't underestimate the power of your voice. Support businesses that are prioritizing sustainability.
Right.
Advocate for policies that promote renewable energy and environmental protection. Vote for leaders who understand the urgency of addressing climate change.
I'm hearing that this isn't just about changing our habits, it's about changing the system. It's about shifting the narrative from short-term profits to long-term well-being.
That's exactly it. And recognizing that sustainable development is a journey. It's not a destination. There will be challenges along the way.
Yeah, for sure.
But we need to keep moving forward, keep innovating, keep pushing for a better future.
Absolutely. Well, as we wrap up this deep dive, I have to admit, I'm feeling a mix of emotions. The problems we discussed are complex and honestly pretty daunting, but I'm also feeling hopeful. Hopeful that we can learn from our mistakes and create a future where both people and the planet can thrive.
That's the spirit. Remember, we're not just passive observers here. We have the power to make choices, to speak up, and to shape the future we want to see.
So what are you waiting for? Dive into the source material, have those tough conversations, and get out there and take action. It's time to create a world we can all be proud of. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks, everyone.